The reason why we think having tapering strips is so important is, for one thing, why did we have to make them? This is because for gradual tapering you need dosages all over the range, and you can only do this if you have very low dosages available. And these dosages have never been made by pharmaceutical companies. Pharmaceutical companies generally, when they bring a drug on the market, they make tablets like we have 10 milligram, 20 milligram and 50 milligram, and that's it. That's where the doctor has to deal with. And guidelines say the recommended dose is 20 milligram for patients with this diagnosis, regardless if the patient is 2 meter and weighs 120 kilogram or is 1 meter 40 and weighs 40 kilogram. Regardless whether it's a man or a woman, they all get the same dose, which is rather weird. So, and in the tapering strips they are available. And this gives patients and doctors a tool to do what guidelines have always asked. If a patient goes too fast, the guideline sets and also the leaflets of the medicine, like if a patient goes too fast, you, doctor, have to let you taper, patient taper more gradually. But they did not explain how, and they did not mention that the tools they needed were not available. And that, in my opinion, is very much the problem that doctors and patients together they have always had. They did sort of know, not really, but even when they knew how to do it, they did not have the tools to do it because these lower dosages had never been made. And well, that's of course strange, because pharmaceutical companies have always known that there were problems with withdrawal, and they've known this for decades, and they've even exploited this knowledge. Like in the oxycodone crisis, they knew precisely what withdrawal symptoms were doing, and they deliberately used these symptoms to get as many people as possible and as long as possible at as much pills as possible at as highest doses as possible, because that was more addictive. People became more dependent, and that allowed them to make so much money. But if you have the knowledge to get people addicted, that means you also have the knowledge to do something about these problems. And in fact, they made very high dosages to improve this addiction, while they should have made the lower dosages. But still, at present, pharmaceutical companies don't deliver these lower dosages, even though they know that they are needed, which is very, very weird. Basically, that's what the tapering strips or the tapering medication is doing. Giving patients and doctors an instrument to together do things better than was previously possible. And this does not mean that guidance is not very useful, and support and all these other things. But the essential thing about support and guidance is that if you taper too fast, they don't take away the withdrawal symptoms. Whereas if you taper more slowly, you can take away the withdrawal symptoms, so things become much more effective, and patients and doctors can work much better together, and that's what we are aiming at. What I see in the medical practitioners, medical science, is that doctors nowadays, psychiatrists, they have to learn a lot about the biology of medications. But when you look in the office of the doctor who has to help a patient, then the story has always been and still is that we do research to find out what is the right medication for the right patient. What we are doing with the tapering strip, I think, is that we give the patient and the doctor a tool to make it easier to discuss what is happening, for instance, when they want to taper a medication or to change the dose, to find the right dose. So if you have complaints while you are lowering the dose of a medication, then the simple advice is don't go on if you experience problem, because most likely your problems will get worse. Something has to be done, and what has to be done differs from patient to patient and from situation to situation, but there are options. And the general satisfaction of patients, and we've asked about this, is that they are much more satisfied about tapering, using the tapering strips, than tapering without. Even the patients who don't succeed, because they have much more the feeling like I have some sort of control about what I'm doing. I have more understanding of what I'm doing. And it's easier for me to talk with my doctor about what's happening. And for the doctor it's the same, because it's easier to discuss it when you have a tool to do things than without. What we have to realize and to accept is that we, at this point in time, we cannot predict how this will be for this patient. If I am a doctor and a patient comes to me, I cannot predict if and how much a patient will suffer from withdrawal symptoms if I say you taper in this or that way. I simply can't. We have risk factors, but none of them is proven, and in the end we will just have to see. And if we accept this and we make a system, we create a system in which it is possible to adapt, and not only theoretically but also practically, what you do during the taper, and if the patient monitors that in such a way that he or she can have a conversation with the doctor, things become much easier. Both the patient and both the doctor, they don't know what the end result will be. Well, you can see it as a problem for the patient and for the doctor, but you can also see it as an opportunity to work together to do it okay. And if you both accept that this uncertainty is there, you can have a conversation about it. And the important thing with tapering, that now you not only can have a conversation about it, but now we have this practical solution that can help you to determine what you should do if certain problems arise. You cannot precisely predict how it will go, but if you find your way together, the results will be much better. That's our philosophy. And I think that the research we have done have shown this. I mean, several thousand people have used these tapering strips now. Among these are quite a number of patients who have tried to stop using, for instance, an antidepressant previously. Some patients have tried it several times and they failed. Why did they fail? Because they had lots of withdrawal symptoms. And if you have too much withdrawal symptoms, the end result will mostly be that people end up using the drug again. And then later on they say, yeah, but I really want to come off them, try it again. And what we have found in our research is that 70% of those people were able to stop using their or to taper down to zero using the tapering strip. And that was one result, and the other result was they were having much less withdrawal symptoms during the tapering. And these two things, these helped to make this complete stop. And the surprising thing is that we could not find a difference between people who had used the medication for a very long time, or at least very little difference, and the ones who were, had been using it for a very long time. So it appears to be possible for patients, even if they have used it for a longer period of time, sometimes very long periods of time, to be able to come off if they have the opportunity to taper gradually enough. And this is not for everybody, but apparently for quite a large group. And I think this is very promising, because we know now that a lot of patients who are using antidepressants probably don't need them, but they are using them because nothing is done about it. They simply keep on using the medication while not knowing if there's a good reason for it. And I think this situation came about because there was no solution to help people properly to taper. And this was a big problem for patients but also a very big problem for doctors. They were expected to know how to help a patient. That's what's always been said. They've always said like, oh, but doctors have guidelines, they know how to do this. But actually we now know, and it's acknowledged by also the professional societies, basically there were no guidelines. Yeah, there were some guidelines, but they were not useful. People were sort of empty-handed, like they had a bad guideline, and they did not have the tools. And these two things combined make the large difference to me. If you look to the stories patients tell and to what happens in clinical practice, then basically nobody really knows very well what was happening in clinical practice. I mean, patients stopped, and there are quite a number of patients who stopped using the medication without informing their doctors. And patients did not hear from their doctors, even if they used medications for a long time. Not all doctors, I mean. But there are supposed to be general moments at which general practitioners talk to a patient, like you are using antidepressants. Is there a reason to talk about discontinuing your antidepressants? But there are people who are using antidepressants for 5, 10 or 15 years and there's never any discussion about that. And I think all these things boil down to the fact that it's complicated for the doctor and for the patient to find out how to come off this medication, and it makes it simpler to just let people use it. And as long as the patient doesn't complain, everybody can have the impression that things are going fine, while they could have gone much better if the patient would be in a position to taper. But without this tool, without this guideline, it's very, very difficult for a doctor and a patient to have a useful, meaningful conversation about this. The patient is afraid, like, if I stop, what can happen? The doctor really doesn't know precisely what to do, and so they sort of keep each other prisoner. And as long as that situation is there, it's always very difficult. And I think things in the Netherlands are now changing because of this medication. In fact, I think that the availability of the tapering strip is changing the practice much more than making better guidelines. In fact, I think that the availability of the tapering strips will improve guidelines as a consequence of the availability of the tool. And you can imagine that too. Once you know that you need this crutch to lift up your car, it's very easy to write a manual. But if you don't have a crutch, what will you do? Take a number of stones, a plank, and whatever. It's much more complicated. Once you have a tool, you can make an easy guideline. And I use the example sometimes of IKEA. IKEA is famous for basically not having guidelines. They've got one picture, and there you see the instruments, you see how many screws, and that's it. And there are almost no words on it, so in every language people can use it. And what they have created is in fact a system that has put France, the Netherlands, wherever, everybody has IKEA tools without having huge guidelines or whatever. Why? Because what people got, they could understand, they could work with it. And I think that's the model we also try to create for the tapering strips. People must understand what is happening. Not only the patients themselves, the doctors too, and they must understand it together to be able to talk about it.